Thank you very much. I appreciate you coming out on a cold day to learn about a ship. You know, that's kind of unusual in itself, but I hope I do a good job in giving you material. I have plenty of material, so be prepared to either read fast. I will read fast. I probably have 100 PowerPoint slides, which is probably 50 too many, but give you an overview of my talk. I'm going to talk about why the ship Michigan was built, some of its specifications for the technical people, and then some of the things that it did when it was in the U.S. Navy service, and then it came out of the service. And my general theme is that this was a pretty historic ship, and it was a shame that it was scrapped. And we'll get into all of that, and I hope you agree with me, although I'm not here to convince you, because what's been done has been done and can't be rectified. That's not the Michigan. That is Perry's flagship Niagara from the War of 1812. It was rebuilt. It was raised in 1913 at the centennial of the Perry victory, and was rebuilt in 1990. I watched it being launched, and I've sailed on it. So why do I show it? I show it because maybe someday somebody might do that, like the state of Pennsylvania did for the Michigan, but I don't think so. Now, why was this ship built? Well, before I get into that, Erie has two famous ships. One is, of course, the Niagara, and that gets all the publicity and all the tourists, and the other is the Michigan that doesn't exist anymore. So it's in a museum, and or pieces of it are, and you'll see some of that in my talk. Most ships are famous for having taken part in a battle. So we have the Niagara, we have countless ships, the Missouri, the Lord Nelson's Victory, and so on have all been preserved, but not the case with my favorite ship. So the Michigan was never in a battle, and as far as I know, it only fired its cannon in anger once. In past times, technology set the pace of progress in warfare and in everything else. Inventions in various fields continued to be wedded together, and certain inventions had to happen for the Michigan to be built and to where we could get to the point in the 1840s. First was the steam engine, and that was built in the 1700s. The first iron ship was built in 1787. It was just a barge, but it floated. Nobody thought it would. First steamship was perfected by Robert Fulton in New York in 1807. So we've made the leap from 1787 to 1807. So the three technological areas are the steam engine, iron for ships, and finally improved weapons. Now, there was a Frenchman named, it's spelling Faixhan, which is pronounced Pahan. I understand. I'm not a linguist in French. In 1823, he made an explosive shell which changed naval warfare. With the explosive, up to that time, cannonballs were shot at ships, and those had smashing effect, but they didn't explode. And the only exploding shells were shot from howitzers or mortars, and when you're at sea, and those have a high arc, you can't hit a ship. So a ship needs a straight trajectory. Well, when Pahan invented this explosive shell, that gave the ships the ordnance that they needed. But it also made a devastating effect on naval warfare, because when that shell hit the ship and it exploded, it did tremendous damage, as you can imagine. So the three things then were the steam engine, iron for ships, and then improved weaponry. And that all led, starting in the 18th century then, to the construction of my ship, the Michigan. Okay, now the navies of the world at that time were very slow to adapt steam and iron. Navies tend to be traditional, and the British Navy, which led the world, was afraid of steam because it required coal. And how do you get coal if you're in the middle of the ocean? You run out of coal. So until they had coaling stations and islands set up, they had to reconfigure everything in order to have steamships. So when they started to get steamships, they kept masts on them and sails because they wanted to rely on being able to get someplace in case they ran out of coal or steam. Therefore steam. So the American Navy had fought a number of wars from the Revolutionary War. Then they fought the Barbary Pirates. They had a quasi-naval war with France, and then the war of 1812. And then our Navy kind of retired, and commercial interests developed steam, like steamboats, and soon by the 1840s or so, there was a lot of commercial traffic in steamboats and even some iron boats, but the navies were slow to adapt to it. And the American Navy did have a steam-powered vessel in New York Harbor for the War of 1812, but it wasn't completed and never got in the war. And then they bought some other smaller steam vessels that in the 1820s that never really panned out. Another innovation that eventually, the early steamboats had paddle wheels on the sides, and those were subject to naval gunfire, which would knock them out. Later came the screw propeller, late in the 1840s, which was underwater, of course, and couldn't be hit by shells very readily, and that was a better system. So that's some background now. All right, that's the Michigan Cleary painting of him, a rendering, and it's pretty colorful. Now what I've done in my talk, since it's the ladies of the lake, I put some ladies in the show just to art it up, you know, and get away from the technical stuff and so on. So there's the Michigan, that's me, that's my name, and there's a lovely lady, a Renoir or somebody's rendering. Okay, the Michigan was a historic ship for many reasons that you will learn. Its story is worthy of being told. The ship was underappreciated, which is an injustice. Her story dovetails with our local history and relates some of the strangest episodes in regional history. Her story makes us aware of the importance of historical preservation and confirms that leadership and money are necessary to achieve it. Okay, some noteworthy vessels. The first steam vessel on the Great Lakes was the Walk on the Water. The Michigan was patterned after this ship, which was Her Majesty's East India Company ship that took part in the Opium Wars. And this ship was iron hull, and it was very devastating, and that was the inspiration for the Michigan. The French had La Gouaire ship, which was the first ironclad ship. It was built in 1859, long before the Monitor and Merrimack that we usually think of as the first ironclads. And then this ship kind of put it all together, the Warrior, with metal and steam and screw propeller. Okay, in both the Revolutionary War and War of 1812, we unsuccessfully invaded British Canada. There was much unrest between the U.S. and Canada, British Canada. Tensions on the U.S. and Canadian border after the War of 1812, there was border disputes with Maine and Oregon. British violations of the Rush-Bagot Treaty of 1880, it wasn't 1818, governing warships on the Great Lakes. They violated that treaty, which was just a letter agreement between some diplomats of the U.S. and Great Britain, saying that we would limit warships on the Great Lakes. So the British started to violate that, and in the meantime, they never gave up building forts and defensive canals. They built the fort in Kingston and kept making it stronger. And they built the Rideau Canal from Ottawa to Kingston to bypass the St. Lawrence River because they were afraid we might cut it at some time. Then here's a typical ship that was on the lakes. The British built these warships and they replied sarcastically that the buildup was necessary and temporary, and we didn't really understand what that meant. And they continued to patrol our waters and would go into a harbor like at Erie or someplace and virtually chart it or inspect it, and there wasn't much that we could do to other than protest. Then British Canada at that time was very unfair, and I'll go over some of the things there. Quebec was French, and English Canada was settled by American Tories after the Revolutionary War, or during the Revolutionary War. A lot of Tories went up there, and they were substantial people generally. Americans were offered free land, and they settled there, and then the Irish had immigrated there. The social and economic system in Canada, the government and the church was controlled by the Tories. They were called United Empire Loyalists, and it was almost like a club. And the system was known as the Family Compact, and it was unfair to anyone not of that class or position. So that was Canada. Then Canada consisted of two provinces, the lower Quebec and then the upper Ontario. Both were owned by Britain. There was friction between the two speaking peoples. The Crown appointed a governor for all of Canada, and he appointed the upper house members, and its lower assembly was elected, but had little power. Its decisions could be vetoed by the upper house and the governor. So you can see that Canadians typically had no power at that time, the average citizen, unless you were in the United Loyalists. Okay, that led to a rebellion in 1837, which incidentally coincides with the founding of the Cleveland Greys as a militia unit. I don't know if the two are connected. I never read that they were, but anyway, political and cultural dissatisfactions in Quebec and in Upper Canada, Ontario caused simultaneous armed clashes in Canadian cities and at Windsor, Prescott, Buffalo, and Navy Island in the Niagara River. The Canadian rebels had considerable U.S. citizen support from Vermont to Wisconsin, and particularly in British Detroit. They formed secret hunter lodges, they were called, to aid in the Canadian conflict. There were armed excursions and raids across the border on both sides. So, given our background, when you hear the Canadian national anthem, "O Canada, we stand on guard for thee," they're standing on guard for us because we had invaded them several times, and there were these rebels trying to overthrow the Canadian government. So it was kind of thought of a manifest destiny that someday we might own Canada by American politicians and so on, or certainly the military. A rebellion in the British possession of Canada. Here's some troops training. And 1837, the Battle of the Windmills near Kingston against rebels and 100 patriots lasted several days and was put down by combined U.S. and Canadian forces with considerable loss of life, including 11 execution of rebel leaders by the Canadian government, and 60 were exiled to Australia. Pretty much how the English treated the Irish in 1916, executing the leaders and so on, that led to a free Ireland. But so tactics hadn't changed. Here's the Carolyn incident. Canadian rebels, aided by American citizens, fled to an island in the Niagara River, and with the U.S. ship Carolyn, British forces retook the ship, killing an American, and they set fire, sending it over to Niagara Falls. That I would have liked to have seen, but the Pirate Bill Johnson, who was involved in this war in other instances, retaliated by destroying a British ship in Canadian waters. So here's the western end of Lake Erie, and the reason I'm showing you that is there's Detroit up here, and the Detroit River comes down into Lake Erie. This is Pelee Island. Down here is Sandusky and Cedar Point. Well, when the lake froze over, hunter lodges from Cedar Point went across and invaded Pelee Island. This sent British regulars and militia across the ice. Thank God the lake was frozen for both sides. And they came down and they clashed. See, these are things you don't know happened right in our backyard. Pelee Island uprising. In a total, 31 loyalists were wounded and 5 were killed. The rebels, 11 were killed and 40 wounded and 20 taken prisoners. So it was a sizable excursion or battle. Canadian Patriot War ended in 1838. On September 9th, 1841, Congress had had enough, and they said, we're authorizing the construction of a state-of-the-art warship to patrol the lakes and to defend American interests. And the other reason for it was the Secretary Upshur here said, we have plenty of iron and coal, and it's cheap and indestructible. So he wanted to promote a prototype of naval technology because he was watching what other nations were doing with the use of wood and steam, and the use of wood for ship hulls and the use of iron for ship's bottom. The use of wind and steam, use of wind sail for propulsion to the use of steam. So these transitions were taking place. The ship was, now we get into some of the technical aspects, designed by Samuel Hart. It cost $152,000, where it was over budget, but wooden frigates cost $350,000, so money's always a factor in this. The ship was built in Pittsburgh because they had a steel industry there, or not steel, but it was wrought iron. And the rigging then was contracted out, and the ship was assembled in Erie. How did it get to Erie? In 42, it was brought by canals from Pittsburgh to Erie that ran through Ohio and Pennsylvania, assembled in Erie, and launched December of 1843, commissioned by the U.S. Navy in 1844. This is just a newspaper publication for bids for lumber for the ship. Incidentally, when they published bids for cannon and stuff for the ship, the British really took alarm, because when they saw the specifications, what they were going to arm that ship with, they were shocked, and so they reacted. So it became one of the few steam-powered ships in the Navy, and it was the first iron-bottom ship in the Navy. Whoops. However, Navy sailors preferred the more traditional bottoms. Now, here's a cutaway view of the ship. Here's the paddle wheels were here. On the outside, they're not drawn there, but here's the engine and so on. And we'll get some more specifications. Here's the finished view of the ship, a really beautiful ship. This picture was in my collection, and it's at Buffalo. And this pilot house was added in 1849, so the picture has to be after that. And its flag has 38 stars, and you'll ask me how I know that, but I'll tell you later, because you can't see them here. But anyway, there she is. She was classed as a steam frigate or a cruiser or a paddle frigate. Length was 176 feet, a mid-sized ship. Displacement 582 tons. Beam, she was 27 foot wide, and if you added the paddle boxes, that made her 45 foot 10 inches. The draft was about 8 feet. Sail rigged as a barkentine, sail for emergency power and for training of sailors. 120 officers, including sailors and Marines. And she had a Marine contingent. Steam engines weighed 88 tons. Pistons were 3 feet wide, 8 foot of stroke, produced a lot of horsepower at 12 knots, nominal horsepower. I don't know what all this means, but technical wheels were 20. Yeah, there's always technical, people ask that kind of stuff.
Sailors in the room.
Yeah. The engines operated for 79 years without a breakdown. The ship carried 120 tons of coal, enough for 7 days, 2,000 to 2,400 miles, certainly enough on the Great Lakes, you know, where your compass, where we live, only has to point south, and you're home. So the top speed was 14 knots, which was the fastest in the world at that time. Armament. Designed to mount 18 guns, she was the heaviest armed steamer in the world. Her firepower was not superseded by any vessel in the Navy till 1855. The British responded upon learning of her construction. We view with alarm. They saw all these guns coming aboard. British reminded us now of the old treaty, the letter agreement, and after they had armed themselves. So they said, what about? And the U.S. Agreed to arm her with one of those Payan guns that shot a 68-pound shot 2 miles distance. So she was rearmed during our Civil War in spite of any agreements. We just didn't care. We wanted that ship to be all it could be. So superiority, speed, range, and it didn't depend solely on wind. Wrought iron is stronger than oak. A half inch of iron is worth 5 inches of oak. She was massively strong, survived a ramming and several groundings. Iron flexes better than wood. Like when you, this is called sagging. When a ship bottom, this would sag in wood and stress and cause leaks. And hogging is when the bow would dip. So iron was better against those things. Non-corrosive hull, wrought iron doesn't rust, and heavy potential armament. When combined with her speed, she could outgun or outrun any ship that she might encounter. So that's pretty powerful stuff for a Great Lakes ship, you know, that really is unopposed at this time. Unique features, her hull was divided into 4 watertight vertical horizontal compartments that added strength and prevented sinking. Compartments could be flooded to control fire or ballast, you know, much like the Titanic, I suppose, you know, had these water compartments. She had high-speed pumps with hoses for fire control or to repel boarders. They could scald them with hot steam. Coal bunkers shielded her engine from shell fire. Her flat bottom amidships made her extremely stable gun platform. And that's really what ships are, is gun platforms. Warships are anyway. And she could reverse her engine. Look at that. See, there she goes. Now, there she is at the prime of life, about 1863. And this is a CDV, a carte de visite that was in my collection. It was bought by the Marine Museum in Erie. It's one of the oldest pictures of the ship. It was taken by Benedict in Put-in Bay. Here's another view. This was in Michigan on the Upper Peninsula. It was painted black at that time. It had these steam launches. Another view of it. Captain Inman was the first commander, and he supervised construction, and he said it was one of the finest steamers in the world. Stephen Champlain was in Perry's battle, commanding the Scorpion. He was the second captain of the Michigan in 1845. He said, inferior to no boat that floats on the lake. This is a typical sailor. I have his, this picture is in my collection. I think Erie bought it, and this was his calling card, and notice it says captain. But he wasn't captain. They just called him captain. And he served as pilot. Now, the key to that is he served 19 years on the ship, 3 years as a boatswain's mate. And since they called him captain, his wife thought he was in the Navy, more or less. So when he died, she applied for his pension, and she found out that boatswains don't get pensions. Oh my gosh. So after spending 19 years there, she struck out, I guess. Now, imagine if this happened today. 1849, President Zachary Taylor, Vice President Millard Fillmore, along with the Pennsylvania governor, were aboard the Michigan during a salute to the dignitaries. A cannon misfired, killing 2 sailors. It also wounded a guy we'll talk about later called Patrick Murphy. He was the gunner's mate. Now, duties of the Michigan. Now we'll get a little bit into duties. It made cruises in the lakes when they weren't frozen, of course. Voyages, a couple voyages to Lake Huron and Lake Michigan, crisscrossing Lake Erie 4 or 5 times a year. In 1854, she did almost 12,000 miles. Her service, what was she doing? She was tending buoys, she was performing rescues, chart making, and so on. So really a working ship. Rescues. Search and rescue between 1844 and 61. Before radar and radio, she participated in 60 rescue operations, and thereafter had 23 more rescues recorded in her logs for an overall total of 83 over her lifetime, saving many lives. And of course, the lakes, we all know, can be very treacherous. So, helping out. Sailor's life included maintaining the ships and drills and practice, and there was floggings aboard the Michigan for getting out of line, I guess. 19th century events. Okay, I'm going to go through 3 or 4 events that took place in the 19th century. One was the timber pirates. In 1853, these pirates were raiding reserves of timber along the Great Lakes, the Lakes Michigan and Huron, Wisconsin, and so on, and they were taking that, they'd set up a sawmill ashore and just cut timber and make lumber and put it on Great Lakes schooners and sail down to Chicago or Milwaukee and sell it, because those towns were booming. And the government didn't like it, because that was not the purpose of these reserves. So the Michigan then would intercept these ships and then take them to court. They reacted, and the Michigan was rammed by the steamer Buffalo. They think deliberately, because there were some connections between the owners of the Buffaloes and the things that were going on, but they couldn't prove it. So her damages were fixed. Michigan was the only effective way of protecting this wood, but lobbyists were able to change some of the laws, and then eventually the timber was exhausted. Now, this is one of the strangest events that ever happened in our region, and here's where it happened, right here, Beaver Island, right at the Straits of Mackinac, and here's Mackinac Island. This fella here, James Jesse Strang, was about 5'3". He was quite a charismatic character, and that's probably the proper term for him. He was a lawyer, and he met Brigham Young, and not Brigham Young, but Joseph Smith, who founded the Mormons. And Smith was impressed with him. In fact, he and his wife became Mormons, and Smith appointed him within a week an elder in the Mormon church. So about a month later, Joseph Smith was killed by assassins. So Strang produces a letter from Smith saying that if anything happens to me, I'm supposed to lead the Mormons. Well, 26 other fellows, including Sidney Rigdon from Mentor, who was a prominent Mormon, said no. So these various Mormons divided into various sects, and Brigham Young said he was kind of the leader of the biggest group, and they excommunicated each other. And Strang ended up with about 300 Mormons, and Brigham Young took a group of them to Salt Lake City, and Strang took a group to Voorhees, Wisconsin, where they settled. So a Mormon sect under Strang established a colony on Beaver Island. When they were at Voorhees, they weren't doing very well. So he he had a revelation that they should all go to Beaver Island in Lake Michigan. So they went up to Beaver Island then in 1847. Now, before this happens, at Beaver Island, Beaver Island was settled by Irish fishermen that ironically had been thrown off an island off the coast of Ireland by a British landlord who wanted it as a hunting reserve. So they looked for an ideal place pretty much like they had off the coast of Ireland, and they settled in Beaver Island. Well, then Strang brings all these Mormons up there. And he found that through squatters' rights, they could come in and take over land there. So in 1850, he declares himself a King James I of his theocratic kingdom up there. Now, news of this kingdom reached President Tyler, I believe it was. But before that happened, a shooting war develops between Mackinac Island and Beaver Island, because Beaver Island was selling fish and wood to ships that went through, and it was taking business away from Mackinac Island, and plus the religious differences. So a shooting war develops between these two groups, and the U.S. government reacts to that, and the Navy, at the request of the president, turns over the Michigan to the state of Michigan, that goes up there in 1851 to arrest Strang and 48 of his followers for counterfeiting, interfering with the U.S. mails, and treason. Transported to Detroit, Strang, a very good lawyer, gets them all off by his arguments. So they go back there, and he had his coronation and so on as king, and he's now got a couple thousand Mormons up there, and he's at least 700-800 of them voting, which is enough to get him elected to the Illinois legislature for 2 terms. And when he's in the legislature, he's not going to take anything from Mackinac Island, which was the county that controlled Beaver Island. He wanted his own sheriff and so on. So he spins off Beaver Island into a new county, and with the county seat at St. James, a town named after him, on St. James Bay, named after him. So Strang approves polygamy then. He had been traveling from time to time to New York to recruit Mormons or find converts, and he traveled with a guy named Charlie, who was really a woman, but Strang was married, and this person passed as a woman, as a man, except to Strang, of course. So he approves polygamy and takes 4 new wives. He fathers 14 children. Now, his demise came about by women's pants. Beginning in the 1850s, women started wearing Turkish pants for convenience and health, instead of those long skirts that dragged on the ground and that needed petticoats and stuff under them. So this was right around the time of Stanton and the other women that were urging women's voting rights and so on. Strang supported bloomers for island women, and he makes the mistake of flogging 2 husbands 39 lashes who objected to his edict. They vowed to get even. So it was bloomers we can blame on Strang's being turned upside down. Okay, in June of '56, Commander McBlair with the Michigan visits Beaver Island and requests Strang to come aboard. As he's coming up to the dock, these husbands jump out and fill him full of lead. He dies 23 days later. The Michigan lets the assassins come on board and spirits them off to Mackinac Island, where they are released. A parade was held because Mackinac was so happy that Strang had been disposed of, and McBlair was exonerated by the Navy. All he had to do was write a report on what happened. There was no hearings or anything, and he and the Michigan officers were complicit in this assassination. It kind of reminds me of the David Koresh thing that we experienced in Texas a number of years ago when you set up a kingdom or set up something the government doesn't like, they take some measures. Okay, the neighbors then, ruffians, so to speak, come and they throw the 2,600 Mormons off the island and take it over again. And in 1895, Strang's County is abolished and it's returned to Charlevoix. It goes to Charlevoix County, the Beaver Islands. I've traveled from Charlevoix to the Beaver Islands. It's an archipelago. There's like 3 or 4 different islands. It's really a beautiful place, at least in the summer. I don't think I want to be there in the winter. Okay, so much for that story. Here's another 19th century thing that Michigan was involved in, was the Civil War. This is a picture of the U.S. Navy. At the beginning of the Civil War, it had about 90 ships. Here is the Michigan, a mid-sized ship. This is a pretty big steamship. There's about 6 steamships in 1854 in our Navy. The rest are these big lumbering ships of the line that are mostly in decay. So we didn't have a very good Navy at the time of the Civil War. The Michigan was the only armed vessel in the Great Lakes during the Civil War. Her activity was confined to the upper lakes, being too large to enter Lake Ontario through the Welland Canal until 1837 when the locks were approved. She was fitted with new steam boilers in 1860. The Naval Board, the chief engineer, Usherwood, became world famous for the engineering studies he did. I have his book. He studied about 6 steam engines, and that knowledge was spread out worldwide, and it enabled the Navy to go from 23 steam vessels at the start of the war to over 600 during the war. In 1861 and 62, the Michigan was involved in recruiting on the lakes. It would go from Buffalo to Cleveland to Lorain to Toledo, drop off recruits that would go down to Cincinnati for the river navies, or could go the other way from Buffalo to New York to be in the Blue Water Navy, the ocean going. So 4,000, over 4,000 recruited, which was pretty remarkable and a pretty nice contribution. And the Civil War, in 1863, the Navy twice increased the firepower of the Michigan in total disregard of the treaty. She showed, in 1863, the draft conscription was brought into the Union Army, and there were draft riots in New York, and at Detroit, Buffalo, and Milwaukee, there was a lot of dissatisfaction, but when the ship would show up with its company of Marines, it calmed things down. In '63, there was fear that something was going to happen on the lakes, so she was sent to guard the federal prisoner of war camp for Confederate officers at Johnson, Ohio, in Sandusky Bay. That's right off Cedar Point, or by the Marblehead Light, around the corner from the Marblehead Light. Now, the Confederates considered a second front in our Lake Erie. Much could be gained from the Confederate cause by disrupting the North on the Great Lakes. In October, Secretary of War Stanton warned, in October of '63, the mayors of Great Lakes cities for possible Confederate shipboard raids from Canada. 3 times the Confederate government considered secretly arming ships on the lakes, taking the U.S. Michigan and freeing prisoners at Johnson's Island. Each time they reconsidered, not wishing to harm British neutrality and upset the ability to purchase arms and blockade runners from England. After Gettysburg, the Confederate government reconsidered its position on the matter. It sent Jacob Thompson, former governor of Mississippi and Buchanan's Secretary of the Interior, with Confederates like Henry Hine and some others, and Confederate gold for secret operations to disrupt the North. Those operations were called the Northwest Conspiracy, and the Lake Erie Conspiracy was part of it. Now, the reason for the Confederate government thinking was, in '63, a Copperhead Clement Verlandingham, I better get some water here, made some anti-government statements which were against the law. Burnside had him arrested. He was convicted. Lincoln said it was better than winning battles convicting him. But Lincoln was afraid that Lincoln, fearing civil disorders after the conviction, exiled Vallandigham to the Confederacy. He says, well, you like the South, go down there. Well, they didn't want him, and so they sent him to Canada. He ran in, now this is, I think, incredible. He ran in absentia for the governor of Ohio in '63, but he lost. He received almost 200,000 votes. And that was 39% of the total votes cast. So it shows how much anti-war feeling there was in Ohio at that time, that he could do that. And of course, campaigning, there was no television, or he wasn't running around. He was in Canada, and he pulled that off. So I think that's pretty remarkable. So the war in the North, in summary, was in trouble by public opinion measures, and the Northwest Conspiracy Second Front made a lot of sense because maybe the North would sue for peace if things were disrupted on the lakes. And here's Vallandigham himself, the devil. Actually, he changed his ways after the war. He was pretty prejudiced, and he became just the opposite. Anyway, here's western Lake Erie, where the next operations take place. And again, we have up here, whoops, should go back. Here is Sandwich and Fort Malden and the Detroit River. Then you have the Bass Islands. You have Sandusky and Cedar Point and Johnson's Island. Again, this is a close-up, again, Johnson's Island and Cedar Point and Marblehead here, and Kelly's Island. So here's the Michigan at Put-in Bay. Incidentally, I own this flag. It's been in the museum at Erie. That's what's pictured there, and it's from Burton, Ohio. It's a great star pattern flag, and they were guards at Johnson's Island along with 128th, which was Huffman's battalion, and there were a lot of different regiments there, but they had a company from Lake County and these other northern Ohio counties. It's now on display in a museum in Erie, but not the Marine Museum. It was in Painesville for a while. Okay, so here's the Michigan at Johnson's Island prison. Take the Michigan. It was resolved to do that. Confederate government resolves to take the Michigan and use the ship to free prisoners on Johnson's Island, then raid lake commerce and Great Lakes cities and locks, like the Erie Canal and so on. They send Charles Cole, who was from Tennessee. He was thrown out of his Tennessee regiment and for being a liar, and he was more or less a charlatan by reputation. Bell, that's pronounced Bell, was a gentleman, and so was Burley. They both served in the Confederate Navy raiding shipping on Chesapeake Bay until it got too hot in terms of federal control of the bay to continue that practice. So they met with Thompson. They met with the Confederate government, then went up to Montreal, met with the Minister Thompson up there who had the Confederate gold, and incidentally absconded with a lot of it after the war, and lived like a king in Europe. Anyway, these three fellas then were to, Cole ashore was to ingratiate the ship's officers. He posed as a oil man, a Pennsylvania oil man, very wealthy. He came down there with like $4,000 cash and lavished it on entertaining the officers and perhaps even bribing some members of the Michigan crew. Bell and Yates were to hijack vessels on the lake and capture the Michigan. So that was the general plan. The ship then was to, once it was taken by them, was to breach the prison stockade, free the prisoners, take many to Canada. The others they thought might fight their way from Toledo down to the south through Cincinnati. But anyway, that was the general plan. Philo. Ed, what do you call that? Philo or Philo? Parsons. Where is Ed? Here. Anyway, these two ships were hijacked by the raiders. Philo, okay? Yeah. So there was some bloodshed in doing that, and the Island Queen was taken when it came alongside the Parsons at Middle Bass when it was getting more wood, and it was eventually scuttled. The Confederates then sat off a Marblehead awaiting Cole's signal. No signal came, and they presumed that he was aboard the Michigan, but he wasn't. Commander Carter, that Ed Keyes last month portrayed, was warned of the plot by a man named Hill in New York, a provost marshal, and they arrested Cole and Sandusky before he could drug the officers. With no signal from Cole, the Confederates lose heart and mutiny against Bell and Burley, and they prepared this letter in which they commend Captain Bell. Maybe he wrote the letter, I don't know, but they signed it saying that they felt the plot had been discovered and it had little chance of success, and therefore they were quitting. So they went back to the Detroit area, Detroit River. Now, what happened to these guys? There's a lot written here, but basically what happened is Cole was arrested. Most of the evidence against him, since they didn't take the ship, was from his own confessions, and that was self-incriminating. He was eventually released. He had traveled with a prostitute that he presented as his wife. Her name was Annie Bison. She was arrested, and he had implicated 6 Sanduskians, and they were all arrested. The various ones were tried, but they were released, and there are some arguments that Cole was, in fact, a double agent, but I don't know if he was or wasn't. But anyway, he went on to lead a normal life after the war. Bell continued his guerrilla activities and tried to wreck a train in upstate New York to free a Confederate officer and rob the express money. He was arrested and he was tried, and he was eventually hung. People said that that Booth was his friend and that Booth had asked Lincoln to spare him, but that's not true. It's just a false rumor. Anyway, he was, some people feel martyred, but anyway. Then Burley escaped to Canada. He was arrested there, and there was a famous extradition case in Canadian law. He was brought back to the U.S. Jefferson Davis and Thompson were able to support his claims of being a Confederate officer. That there wasn't time enough to do that for Bell, or he might have been saved. Burley was released to U.S. authorities. He was tried in Ottawa County, Ohio, for a lesser criminal offense of robbing a passenger on the Philo Parsons. The jury was hung. He was held in jail, and he escaped, leaving a note saying, "I've gone out for a walk, and perhaps I will return." He becomes a reporter for the London Daily Telegraph, changes his name or spelling of it, and becomes a world-famous writer and author. So, must have been an all right guy. What happened to the Michigan? Carter, that Ed Keyes portrayed, by pursuing the Parsons, Carter had violated a direct order from Gideon Welles, Secretary of the Navy, to remain on station until reinforcements, that's Army reinforcements, could arrive. Some believe the Michigan's crew might have been compromised by bribes from Cole, casting doubts about Carter's loyalty, and he was originally from the South. Cole, in fact, had written to Thompson that Carter could not be bought. That Carter had expressed doubts to Welles that the ship was in any danger at some point. So anyway, Carter was never court-martialed or disciplined. However, the ship was taken away from him. And He was put on the Navy retirement list. His wife went to bat for him along with Congressman and President Johnson, and he was finally restored. And after he was restored for about 5 years, he died at age 65. In truth, Carter was a loyal career Navy officer with 45 years of faithful service. Now here's Patrick Murphy. He got a he served 20 years on the Michigan. He got a Congressional Medal of Honor. And the next thing that happens is the Fenian invasion of Canada. He played a role by delaying the Michigan to support the Irish. I'll get into that a little bit. Napoleon Collins served aboard the Michigan twice, and he captured a Confederate raider in Bahia Harbor in Brazil, which created an international incident, which the Navy loved, but tongue-in-cheek court-martialed him, but he retired an admiral in the Navy. I mean, you can't capture a Confederate raider and then be in trouble for it, even if it is in a foreign bay. At least that was what happened. Okay, post-war, the Peninsula War, there was a strike in copper prices went down, and there were copper mines supplying copper for armaments in the Civil War, brass cannons and shells. So anyway, the workers there struck. The Michigan was sent up there, and Commander Rowe landed his Marines, mounted a cabin on a rail car, and with judicious use and show of force averted bloodshed and the destruction of property. The actions demonstrated that civil authority would maintain order by the use of force through the alliance of the military with business interests. I don't think things have changed much since then. Okay, the Fenians, and it was the American branch of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, invades Canada in 1866. British opposition or oppression in Ireland bred discontent, violence, genocide, and exile for the Irishmen. Over 225,000 Irish served in the Civil War on both sides. Numerous officers and men were Fenians on both sides. The Brotherhood intended to use their Civil War experience against England in Ireland after the war. In June of '66, they had these lodges all around, like we have veterans lodges, VFW and so on, that were Irish Brotherhood Fenian lodges. In 1866, thousands of Fenians, like 10,000, arrived in Buffalo to invade Canada, where they had stored guns and ammunition. Some 1,500 crossed before the U.S. Michigan arrived. Then she was delayed because Patrick, the Medal of Honor winner, Patrick Murphy, took the civilian pilot that the Navy wanted out drinking. And so the Michigan didn't want to go up and down the Niagara River without a local civilian pilot that knew the waters, because the Niagara River is pretty swift and pretty dangerous. So anyway, with Civil War veterans in their ranks and commanded by Civil War generals and officers, they being the Fenians, defeated the Canadian militia and regulars at the Battle of Ridgeway, Ontario. They intended to hold parts of British Canada for British concessions in Ireland. Frustrated by the USS Michigan, they were unable to reinforce or get resupplied. The Fenians were returned to the U.S. by the ship, and no one was ever prosecuted by the USA, even though it was a violation of law. The Fenians continued with 5 other small incursions to Canada through 1871. The Fenians financed the Fenian John Holland in 1895 to create the Fenian Ram, the first modern submarine, which incidentally the Germans used against England, so it was kind of Irish revenge. The Battle of Ridgeway stylized. It took place, here is Buffalo, then there's Fort Erie here, and then Ridgeway is right here. This is a Harper's picture of the Michigan removing Fenians from Canada in a barge and so on. That's the only time it fired its cannon towards, I don't know, I suppose Fenians to get their attention. In 1897, Secretary of War, later President Theodore Roosevelt embarked on the ship during its summer naval maneuvers. He watched gunnery practice. 1898, the Michigan cruised to various Great Lakes ports to recruit sailors for the Spanish-American War. Gridley, that famous fire when ready Gridley, served aboard the Michigan. He married an Erie girl, and here he is pictured here aboard the Michigan. And he settled in Erie and became keeper of lighthouses. Changing ship, the ordnance changed, the pilot house was added, the paint was changed. New boilers in 1893 were added that changed her buoyancy and her appearance. In 1897, a large chart house was added for charting waters, and her rigging simplified. She was now called a mechanical duck because of the change in buoyancy in the chart house. So that's something that she looked like, and you see the chart house here. Old age service in 1905. Her name was given to a new battleship. She's now called the USS Wolverine. So there's the difference between the two ships over the years. In 1905, inspection showed that her waterline was free of corrosion. In 1909, her hull was also fine. 2 small areas of acid damage. 1911, the Michigan was decommissioned by the Navy after 68 years of service, the 3rd longest commissioned ship in the entire history of the U.S. Navy. Only the Constitution and the Constellation were longer. In 1911, the Navy loaned the ship to the Pennsylvania Naval Militia. This transfer gave her 11 more years of use of service. A militia pin there, and from 1912 to 1923, she trained reserve officers in the Pennsylvania Militia, Naval Militia. She became a part of Erie society the whole time she was there. Officers lived in Erie hotels in the winter, and sailors had part-time jobs in Erie and married so many Erie girls that this city was called the mother-in-law of the Navy. Sailors formed Michigan and Wolverine sports teams, and they played in local leagues. Officers and sailors and Marines participated in parades and civic ceremonies and so on, social functions. There's a tea and concert program, 1897, I think it is. Whatever it is, on in the corner. Fun and games, some of the sports that they had a notice here that this, they put a wooden house over the decks in the winter with skylights and so on for heat and warmth. The officers had a racing ice boat on Erie Bay. The baseball team, it says here, the clubs are composed of Marines from the warship Wolverine and soldiers from the state encampment, and they are said to be the equal of many professional teams. How about that? Football team, rowing team. Here's the Marine contingent. There's an old movie of McKinley's assassination in which there's Marines marching like that, taking part in that in Buffalo. Okay, more service in 1912. The Commander Morrison raises Prairie's flagship, the brig Niagara. Maybe it was the Lawrence, they don't know. It was rebuilt for the centennial. The Michigan towed it around the lakes, and then in 1917 for World War I, the Michigan did training duties at Great Lakes Naval Center. It got a wireless, but there weren't no radios to correspond with. Michigan Centennial towing it. Beginning of the end in 23, it broke a piston up at the Straits of Mackinac. It limped back to Erie. No Navy money to repair it, no city money. It's berthed at Erie State Street Pier. Then it's moved over to Misery Bay, which is here. That's where Perry's ships spent the winter after the War of 1812 or during the war, and it was miserable. And so the Michigan is brought from the State Street Pier over to here and beached in 1927. Some pictures and postcards of it. Here's kind of a rough place. The peninsula wasn't as nice back then. as it is today. Her name was given to this Cleveland steamer C&B, which was made into an aircraft carrier to train pilots during World War II. It trained thousands of pilots. There was 2 Great Lakes cruise ships that this was done to. The Sable, it was done as well. And that was necessary because when the war started, we only had 4 carriers. And how do you train carrier pilots with 4 carriers? You can't take them out of the service, so they had to convert these ships to do it. And like 24,000 pilots were trained, or whatever they had there. And some of those planes are down in Lake Michigan, 600 feet deep, and when they bring them up, they're very valuable because they're in good condition. Okay, and in the final illness in 28, Henry Ford offered to buy the Wolverine. It was stationed in Detroit for a while, but when it was charting the river there. The Erie Historical Society estimated that $200,000 is needed to refurbish her. In 1930, Michigan made an overture to acquire her from Erie. The response is that Erie said the ship isn't ours. In 43, Franklin Roosevelt vetoed, if you will, in a letter that it would be worth more to keep the ship than scrapping her for metal. Hope it lasted in 43. The Niagara League wants to save the ship. That's an Erie group. Another group, Foundation for the Preservation of the Original Michigan, seeks title from Congress and receives it under an 1893 Cultural Gift Act. The members of it voted 98% to scrap. Okay, the final trip to the cutting torch, pumped out. Her hull is near perfect per Republic Steel's testing. Only her woodwork is bad. She floated perfectly while towed to the scrapyard, almost swamps her towing sub, rescues 2 crewmen from the bay that climbed aboard her, and she, in breaking the tow line, she bolted towards Lake Erie like she knew her fate. There she is. I have a lot of other pictures of her. Once a proud ship, rendered $24,000 in scrap metal. This is Turner's ship, the Victory, being towed after his victory at Trafalgar. Okay, here's kind of typical public sentiment. You damn fool, I thought all the idiots were dead, but you are not. You are a prize one. Your article to donate paint for that damned old piece of junk at the foot of State Street, you are more hard up for a way to spend money when there is such suffering and poverty in the world, even in our own city. So all you should donate is a good mess of dynamite to blow the disgraceful old scow. It wouldn't cost that much. The article entitled 10 years ago and so on, Morrison, who was the commander of it, scrapping the son of a SOB, was a smart man. His name wasn't Richardson, who must have been involved in this article. Well, if someone here well, you can read it as well as I, doesn't sink it, he's going to quit the newspaper. Anyway, that's public sentiment. What became of the Michigan? They sold pieces of it as souvenirs and raised $2,400 other than the $24,000. 10 foot of her prow and steering gear, side eagle ornament, and her anchor are on display at Erie's Marine Museum that has a major feature exhibit on the 2nd floor there. Her bell and gangway boards are in Erie on loan from Newport News. This is Sam Tannenbaum. He ordered this on the scrapyard. He gave that bow to the city of Erie. It used to be outside. Now it's inside the museum. I watched this model being built and photographed it by a guy named Skip Nagel and another fellow who was in his 90s. It's on display there. It's beautiful. There it is with the bow behind it. You should visit that museum. Ship's bell and the emblem that was on the side of the paddle boxes. Her wheel. Fairport has her mast right here. I did a dedication speech there when they refurbished it a few years back. I had a half a dozen, actually maybe 8 items at the Erie Museum. This is some of my stuff. I'm pointing to my name. I think that's I was younger and handsomer. This is Hinton. That was taken from my CDV. This was Hinton's powder flask, which I sold to the museum. This is his binoculars. I sold it to him, and his spy glasses. So they're all on display. I don't know if I still get credit or not, but when they were on loan, I got credit. I haven't been back to see what happened. I own this flag. Now that's how I knew there was 38 flags, because that picture came with the flag along with affidavits. And this is a beautiful flag, and it's huge. I don't have a wall. We don't have a wall here that would support that flag. So I don't know what I'm going to do with it. The Marine Museum wants to buy it, but like all museums, they're out of money, and I don't want to give it, at least not just yet. So anyway, we stay in touch about it. Yeah, there it is flying. So why wasn't the Michigan saved? Her contributions were not recognized due to focus of the U.S. Navy and historians, I should say, towards a blue water ocean navy. She was already 16 years old when naval technology accelerated during and after the Civil War. No one looked back to see that she had come first and contributed to that technology. The Navy in 1911, nor the city of Erie and the state of Pennsylvania, they failed to realize the historic value of the ship, although Henry Ford and Franklin Roosevelt understood her worth. Public attitudes towards preservation in '49 were not the same as today. Civic leadership was lacking and were unable to garner support. Her decay became an embarrassment to the city of Erie, an eyesore, the mechanical duck rather than the guardian of the Great Lakes or the lady of the Great Lakes. She was viewed as a problem to be solved. For lack of money, she was betrayed by the Foundation for the Preservation of the Original Ship, Michigan, who invoked the final solution well short of its stated mission. What lessons can we learn? That's for you to ponder and answer. Is the destruction, like going on today, a renewal of Confederate monuments hasty or short-sighted? What's your position on those controversies? You know, I don't know. Her honors, this was the conclusion. She was first Iron warship, one of the first of the world, the third largest commissioned ship. She bridged the gap to the transition, at least for warships, and contributed to that transition. She was fostered by Canadians' Patriot War and participated in many historical events in the Great Lakes region. Fought the timber pilots, addressed the Mormon Kingdom situation on Beaver Island, stopped the Fenian invasion of Canada. She participated in 3 world wars, the Civil, the Spanish-American, and World War I, recruiting and training many sailors for the Navy and other for careers on the lakes. She rescued many ships from disasters. She charted our waters, tended our navigation aids. She was a fine citizen, a very PA, an outstanding representative of the Navy, truly a magnificent lady. Farewell. Few have watched me sail away, will miss my craft from the busy bay. Some loving soul that my heart held dear, in silent sorrow will shed a tear. That's a poem by Lizzie Clark Hardy. Okay.